Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Amcrott. I'm the Executive Director of Case Western Reserve's Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, a session of our 2018 Northeast Ohio Public Policy Series, and tonight's program addresses gun laws in the state of Ohio. It is a pleasure also to welcome you to the Tincomville University Center on the campus of Case Western Reserve University. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce our panelists, I want to recognize and thank a few organizations who are especially important in making this year's public policy series possible. Our program partners include the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, the Cuyahoga County Public Library, Cleveland Heights University Heights Public Library, the Lakewood Public Library, and we're pleased to welcome as a partner Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter. And we are also grateful to our corporate sponsor, First Interstate Properties Limited, for supporting the series. I do want to point out one change in our upcoming schedule. The session that was scheduled for tomorrow night has been rescheduled for Thursday, September 27th, and that is Why Should I Vote? What's at Stake in the November Election, which will be moderated by Harry Boomer from Channel 19. The location is still to be determined, so please check our website at the Lifelong Learning Program or at the League of Women Voters, and I'm sure you'll be getting email about the that session as well. We do ask for no verbal outbreaks from the audience during the program, as it's really geared towards hearing from our panelists. There is time set aside later in the session for some Q&A. And we ask all of you, if you have questions, to write them on note cards that are circulating. If you do not have a note card or a pencil and you need one, just raise your hand and it will be brought to you. And then when you do have a question on the card, just raise your card and someone will come and collect it. So that is it for all of our public service announcements. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Peter Krouse, public interest and advocacy reporter with Cleveland.com. Prior to that position, he was editorial writer and member of the Northeast Ohio Media Group Plain Dealer Editorial Board. Altogether, Peter has been with Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer for over 18 years. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Peter Krouse.
Thank you, and thank you for coming this evening. I hope this is going to be a interesting public forum on a very, very important topic. Our forum tonight is actually entitled Gun Violence, What Are the Options? And with us tonight are four panelists, two legislators, a college professor, and a police chief, all of whom I will introduce in just a moment. But first, let me just say a few things. Why are we here? Well, why do we feel it is important to spend this evening talking about gun violence, what should be done about gun violence, and whether we need to enact more laws to control possession and ownership of guns? Well, we need to look no further than downtown Cincinnati last week, when a gunman walked through a bank lobby with a 9mm handgun and a ton of ammunition, firing off shots at whoever he saw. He killed 3 and injured 2. The gunman is dead, and we may never know what possessed him to commit such an evil act. Sadly, this story is played out time and again. Columbine, Parkland, Las Vegas, Virginia Tech, Chardon, just to the east of us. But these are the high-profile mass shootings. What about the slow drip of deadly gun violence that infects our cities every day? Last week, there were 5 homicides in 5 days in Cleveland. 4 involved a gun. An average of 96 people are killed with guns in the United States each day, and twice as many are injured. This according to the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. Since 1999, more than 187,000 students have experienced a shooting on campus during school hours. This very campus had such a shooting on May 9th, 2003. I remember it well because my daughter was born that day over in UH Hospital. So what are the answers? Well, that depends on who you ask. Tonight, we're going to ask 4 panelists what they think about the epidemic of gun violence and what should be done with it. First, we have Daniel Flannery. a professor with the Begun Center for Violence Prevention Research and Education here at Case Western Reserve University. We have Senator Michael Skindell from the west side of Cleveland, who is a Democrat. We have Republican Mike Henne, who is from the Dayton area. And we have Chief Andy Gonzalez of the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority. Now, to get us started, I want to read one more thing. And this is a letter that was penned by Representative Henne shortly after the Parkland shooting earlier this year. This was an open letter, and it's on his website for anybody to read. In the event of a mass shooting, we get mad. We assign blame. We demand change. Some feel there are too many guns in our society, while others believe a lack of guns at locations make them easy targets. Maybe after we separate ourselves from the raw emotions of the situation, we can actually listen and have an open dialogue about the issue while protecting and respecting people's rights. It seems that both sides oversimplify the problem and draw a hard line in their beliefs. Yet compromise and finding middle ground is not impossible. We must recognize the status quo is untenable and understand we have an inherent constitutional right to own guns in the United States to protect ourselves. So with that, I'd like to first ask each of you if you would kind of give us an opening statement about where you think our state, our country, but our state in particular, needs to go to combat gun violence. And Representative Henne, let's begin with you.
There we go. Good evening. First of all, I want to thank the organization for starting this dialogue. You know, we always seem to only want to talk about this right after a shooting, and emotions are high, and we really can't make any kind of comprehensive, good decisions when we're dealing with strictly emotions. So this is somewhat of a better time. We haven't had anything real recently. Right after that Parkland shooting, I did have I mean, I really was moved by that. I really felt that, you know, as I stated in the letter, the status quo was untenable. We really needed to come up with something. So I put everything on the table and I researched what we could do. And I did introduce a bill. I think we'll get into that in a little bit. But I did want, you know, I think one time we make it too simple. We say there are legal guns and illegal guns. Gun owners, I should say. But I think it's not that simple. I think there's also another category. We got responsible gun owners, illegal responsible gun owner, and then the irresponsible gun owners. And I think we need to take the responsible gun owners and use them as a model and somehow make that what everybody strives for. Every gun owner, whoever, if you choose to own a gun, that's what you need to be as a responsible gun owner. And I think with the right dialogue and some reasonable legislation, we might be able to accomplish some of that. So that's kind of where I came into this discussion. I'm not even a gun owner, but I'm a staunch supporter of the Second Amendment. So that's kind of where I was brought into this discussion.
Senator Skindell.
Thank you. First, I am Senator Mike Skindell. I represent parts of the greater Cleveland area, particularly the west side of Cleveland, Lakewood, Parma Heights, Brooklyn, and a number of other suburbs. I grew up in a semi-rural area out in Medina County at a time when Medina County was not built up. My father was a steel worker, and he was an avid hunter. I grew up with guns in my home, and had gone hunting with my father. As I was telling Peter, though, I was not one to kill anything. I never did, and I let that up to my father. But did go out for the experience and grew up around guns. And I live in an urban area, unlike Representative Henne, who has a suburban and going into somewhat more of a rural area. And so there's different interests involved in particularly an urban viewpoint and a rural viewpoint. The current path that we are on is the wrong path, I believe. And what I've seen in my time in the legislature is an explosion of gun legislation that is moving towards a permitless carry state. And that is the goal of certain lobbyists in the state and certain interests in the state, is to make sure that it's permitless and allow anybody that wants a gun to carry that gun. I do believe that there are different interests that an urban setting has versus a rural setting. And when the legislature, and my understanding is we'll be talking about this later, is when the legislature totally preempted local gun ordinances and just says only the state can regulate guns. It did not take in consideration the competing interest of the two areas. And that's something that I think the state should re-examine in this area. Thank you.
Okay. Chief Gonzalez, where do we go?
Good evening, everybody. I think it's kind of ironic you put the cop right in the middle of the panel here. So
Keep the peace.
Keep the peace. Thanks for including me in this discussion. I don't know where we go. I don't think that that's my purpose tonight, to tell you where we ought to go. But I do want to share with you that gun violence is an everyday conversation with me and my team and my command staff. I don't think that there's a day that goes by that we don't discuss the prevalence of guns on the streets, the emerging or the more problematic issue for me, which is the growing number of kids, youth, that have access to firearms and are carrying them and using them. You heard Mr. Krouse say 5 homicides last week. You know, one of those homicides was right in our backyard at CMHA. We are the 8th largest public housing authority in the United States. We serve 55,000 people, and about 25,000 of those people rely on us to provide safe housing. And so the challenge for me and my team is, how do we take this emerging trend that has been emerging for a while, and how do we create a deployment, or at least a response that will will take our residents from a heightened level of fear, concern, to maybe a less heightened level. And that's the challenge for us. We just, I don't know what the answer is to that. I find often that as a police officer, I've been doing this since 1981, that as a police officer, we respond more to the symptoms of issues rather than the issue itself. So perhaps by the end of this evening, rather than have a discussion about, how to resolve, maybe the answer lies in really trying to identify what's causing all this violence. Why are our kids and even adults, why are they acting up the way that they're doing, and why are we as a society more prone to resort to violence rather than just have a plausible discussion about resolving problems? That's where I'm at.
Thank you. Professor.
Thanks, Chief. Good evening. First thing I would say is that we should do about this issue is vote. You should vote for the people that represent your views on this particular issue, because that's the only way certain things are going to happen. This isn't just a law enforcement problem. We're not going to solve it just with a law enforcement response. I think we need to address violence as the complicated social problem that firearm violence is, and we need to take a public health approach to addressing this issue, which means multiple levels of things. It means the universal background checks for everyone, and implementing a system that's supported and accurate, so that if you believe that access is an issue and certain people shouldn't have access to firearms because they're not responsible gun owners, then we should have reasonable background check systems while we're still protecting a person's right to own a firearm. Maybe they need to wait 48 hours before they can get that because they're going through a background check. From my perspective, information gathering is a big issue here in this space. For the last 20 plus years, there have been serious restrictions on any federal funding for firearm-related research at the federal level. So we know very little in this space about policies and laws that have been put in place in certain states and whether those are effective or not. We don't know much about the real connections between mental health and firearm violence. We don't know about averted shootings and what it takes to prevent a school shooting or a mass shooting. So I think information gathering about informing this conversation so that we don't go immediately to the extremes on this issue is important, because right now we don't know. The information we have is anecdotal or politically driven or emotionally driven. So I think we need a better informed conversation at all levels around this problem.
Well, let's just follow up on that really quick before we get into legislation. Why the federal government prevents federal spending on basically on gun violence research? Is that right? What was the rationale?
I can't speak for the decisions that were made in the early 1990s. I know what the implications of it were. It meant that if you were getting funded by the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institutes of Health or the Department of Justice, you were restricted from asking anyone about their ownership. For example, if you're a pediatrician, you were not allowed to ask if there were firearms in the home as part of your well child check. If we surveyed young people about violence, we couldn't ask them about firearm violence, firearm ownership, or victimization. And in fact, even in our federal law enforcement systems, it's illegal for them to connect a name to a firearm. So a law enforcement officer, correct me, Chief, if I'm wrong, but you can't call up the ATF and say, does John Smith own this gun because we think it was used in a crime or a homicide? They don't have that information because of the concerns about keeping data on people who own guns or how many they have is viewed as a potential risk towards a person's Second Amendment rights to own as many firearms as they would like.
Now, does that exist at the state level too? Do we know?
At the state level, actually, there is funding of that type of research generally does not exist. There is no law that prohibits, for example, Ohio State from gathering information, but at the federal level, because there are restrictions, they can't get that information because of the federal law. So although there's no state restrictions, there's no state funding going into that type of research. Mm-hmm. And if there was anyways, there would be restrictions because of the federal law.
As legislators, how important do you think it would be to you in doing your job in creating laws that around gun violence? Would it help you to have more information? Would it help you to have this research?
On every piece of legislation that comes before us, most pieces of legislation, there's in-depth research on the impact, and that's something that legislators are always looking for. So if somebody's requesting funding for a certain program, we as legislators look at what type of impact and how can we monitor that impact. We provide funding. For example, the issues with Lake Erie water quality and the algal blooms. We provide funding for that research, and we want results for that research so we can make policy. The problem we have with gun legislation is you don't have that type of research. So you have just anecdotal comments made on discussions on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate that gun violence is increasing, or it's actually remaining the same or decreasing. But there's no real evidence to support it one way or another.
Always, information is always good when making legislation, but I will tell you, the information about who owns guns, I'm not sure really is critical to the discussion. We know where the guns are used. We know who shoots it, who is killing who. We can research it that way, but without, the very conservative gun owners do not want their information about their guns shared with the federal government. Okay, that's just an absolute fact, and that's just not a starting point. And I'm not sure that, once again, I'm not sure that data is that relevant. If I have 14 guns in my safe, then I'm not sure if they're never used in a crime and never killed anybody. I'm not sure that's an information that really gives you the solution to the problem.
Well, let's ask, first of all, keep your mics on when you're done, because otherwise it's causing some kind of a feedback. Chief, can you respond to that a little bit? As a police chief, what kind of information can your officers, can your department use to better battle gun violence, prevent crimes involving guns? What kind of information would you like to have as a police department that you're not getting now?
Well, the immediate answer we look for is who has the gun. I mean, who's the suspect and who's responsible for pulling the trigger that caused this horrible thing to happen? That's the first question. But our investigation needs to go deeper than that, because there's more questions once we answer that question. And the next question that we ask is, where did you get the gun? I mean, that's where we have a hiccup. And that's where we have a significant disconnect between these things that we're talking about now and true law enforcement, which is tasked with solving crime and bringing justice, or at least a sense of justice, to the families that has suffered, that has gone through the trauma of that crime. I can tell you this, that we grow very, very frustrated. Dr. Flannery is correct when we do call ATF. ATF is a very good partner of ours. We do call them. They're in our, check off list. Check with the ATF to see if they have any information on where these guns came from, and 10 times out of 10 times the answer is I don't know. The only way that we get a trace on a firearm is we have to either produce a casing, which is the spent once you shoot the gun, or the actual bullet fragment itself, the bullet or a fragment of it. And then even then it's iffy. Then that information is placed or put into a database which searches whatever information. So if no information is in the database, then guess what comes back to us? Nothing. We don't get any information. So we're right back to where we started, which is we know that you are responsible for pulling the trigger. We want to know where you got the gun, because we need to now engage in preventive efforts and prevent wherever it is that you got that gun from continuing to provide guns out in the street. So if there was a way that the powers that be, whether it be legislators or whoever they are, that they can loosen up or at least make a requirement that we should be able to track who the owner was. Where did we get this firearm? How did you get it? That would really, really help us out. The flip side of it is that anecdotally, I don't think that any police chief in this state can tell you for certainty, but anecdotally, we know that the guns that are used on the streets are coming via straw purchases. And what I mean by that is that there's gun shows. Every county has a gun show. There's many gun shows. And the regulations on those gun shows is very, very loose, if you have any regulations in those gun shows. So it's very, very possible that a person can go to a gun show, sell X amount of firearms, because there's no limit as to the number of firearms, but pose themselves as a private person, sell 100, whatever amount of firearms there are. Somebody will buy those firearms. And then typically what happens is when they leave the venue, they'll go out into the parking lot or someplace that's already predetermined, and there's another sale that goes on. And so we know for sure, for certainty, that is happening because some of the kids and some of the people that agree to talk to us after they commit the crime, they're telling us that that's how they got it. Well, give me a name. Well, I don't know who the name is. Well, what does he or she looks like? Well, there's this dude, he was up there, he opened up his trunk and he showed me this and he told me for 50, 100, whatever amount of money, we agreed I can get the firearm. So yes, it would be great if we knew who that person that opened up the trunk was, but right now we just don't have any viable means or any control measures, as I would like to say, any control measures with checks and balances that says, okay, this gun belonged once upon a time to this person, so let me go back to this person and find out how many other guns he has put out on the street.
So Chief, you said something about access a little while ago. Before these limitations on funding to do this kind of research or just ask these kinds of questions to get information, some research was done right here in Cleveland by a gentleman by the name of Norm Rushforth, who was here at Case, and a physician by the name of Art Kellerman. And they did some really well-regarded and well-publicized studies back in the 70s and 80s, which really showed that the more access you had to any kind of firearms, the increase your risk was significantly higher for being a victim of a homicide, a perpetrator of a firearm injury, using it in a suicide, or being a victim of an accidental shooting. Independent of your position on the Second Amendment and anything else, the sheer fact is having more guns around, having greater access to them, increased your risk for injury, particularly intentional injury, but also accidental injury in all of these categories. So that's where when we had information to say, at least we know that that's not only a fact, it seems to be a true fact. More guns around, the more likely it's going to be used. We just don't know the answer to some of these questions. If a particular policy or law is effective in changing the scenario here, or if it's just not. It's not an issue of how many you own. It's only an issue when it's used in a violent crime or an injury, and then it's traced back to someone else. But there are also plenty of examples of people that quote unquote purchase firearms legally and then use them in an irresponsible way. So that's just my point about this. We just don't know. So if you ask, what should we do? I don't know, because we don't have enough good information about what's actually going on.
Just to kind of build upon that, but the straw purchase is illegal. I mean, you cannot buy a gun and sell it. And if we did have a registry of guns, the criminal element will not register their guns. I mean, when I started looking into this, I wanted to make legislation that had a chance of actually making a difference and not just penalizing people because they are gun owners. Once again, I'm not even a gun owner anymore. When we had kids, we got rid of guns in the household. That was a family decision we made. But I'm really gravely concerned about making laws that penalizes the responsible gun owners and makes us feel good, but doesn't do a lot. I mean, those two Westerville cops were killed by a straw purchase. Okay, tragic, and those it was already illegal. So it doesn't I mean, it's to make new laws that only penalizes that don't really do anything is one of my biggest concerns.
Peter, if I could give you an experience I had earlier this year, I actually reintroduced some legislation regarding an assault weapons ban for here in Ohio. And a conservative talk radio host had me on his radio show, and we were talking about this legislation to ban assault weapons. And he said, "What evidence do you have that this would correct anything?" And I said, "Well, actually, there was well-publicized research that was publicized last year. It was done by private entities that showed that the 10 years before the federal assault weapons ban, which has existed from 1996 to 2006, there was a higher rate of killings and shootings with assault weapons being used. In the 10 years that the ban was in place, those types of crimes had gone down. And after the assault weapons ban was lifted, those crimes increased. And but this was private funding. It was private research, not done by the federal government. And the talk radio show host, "Well, show me federal research. I'm not going to believe that private research. Show me the federal research that demonstrates this." Well, the feds are not able to conduct that type of research. Right. So the hands are tied, and the conservative side criticizes us for bringing forward legislation and saying that it's not backed up and will not solve the problems out there.
Let me ask a follow-up question. Straw purchasers of guns, who do they buy them from? Do they buy them from legitimate gun owners at a gun show or off the internet?
The theory is that they're either hired or that is their purpose for going into a legitimate environment to purchase a firearm or purchase firearms. The issue of straw purchase is not relevant to walking into a gun show and actually buying a firearm. The issue of the straw purchase is what happens after you acquire the firearm, and then what are you going to do with it? Whereas what I'm saying is that if we knew that you walked into the gun show and that we knew that you bought this firearm, and through a trace, which is the only way that we would able to go backwards to find out where this firearm came from, then point to Andy Gonzalez walked into a gun show on this day and bought the gun. Then I can go up to Andy and say, "Hey, you purchased a firearm on this day, which resulted in a homicide on this day. Do you know what you did, what happened to that firearm after you bought it?" That's, I hate to say this, but it's a common sense thing. If I need to find out who is responsible for perpetrating a crime in our neighborhoods. And if the only option that I have is I have a gun casing, or I have a bullet, and maybe I even have the firearm, but I need to go backwards, work backwards to try to solve this, to bring peace to the family about this is the person responsible. I got to start somewhere. And the frustration in law enforcement is that we don't have a starting point from which to conduct our investigation, simply because there is no record of where this firearm originated, who purchased this firearm.
So if you had the registry, that may eliminate some of these straw purchases, is what you're saying.
Maybe not even a registry, but if a universal background check system is in place and required of purchases at gun shows as well, it's a potential intervention point, right? So if we're talking about reducing gun violence incidents, and you know somebody's actually buying and then selling those firearms to someone who shouldn't have them, the irresponsible or illegal or person with, the felony record that's not supposed to have one, then there's a potential point of intervention for the folks. So everybody seems to agree there are certain folks that shouldn't have a firearm, just not me, right? So I understand your position, and I would agree that you don't want to have laws or policies in place that don't have an effect, but just by saying a priori they're not going to have an effect, I would say, yes, they need to be reasonable. There needs to be a starting point, but we don't know that that's the answer, that they would have no effect. So my question would be, where's the place we could start? Anywhere on this continuum of potential points of intervention or action to make even a little bit of a difference in one piece of this puzzle that people could agree on and gather information and share it. So now we get into the sharing of information when there's a mental health issue and other things at play, to perhaps move the needle just a little bit in the direction most of us anyway, I think would like it to go in, and that's to reduce firearm injuries and death.
So the straw purchases generally, the general understanding for that is that it's a purchase of a gun by somebody who legally cannot obtain it through legal means. So that's one issue. The other issue is, again, the loopholes that are in the system. The purchase of guns at a gun show, the purchase of guns online, the purchase of a gun from your neighbor or family member. Those types of purchases, you don't have to go through the background check and the permitting process for those types of purchases. So we have to try to deal with the straw purchases, and some of that is looking at people going into other states where there's weaker gun laws, buying a gun there, bringing it into Ohio. We have the selling it to people that should not be having a gun, somebody under 18 or 21 in some circumstances, or because of some other condition is precluded from having a gun. So we need to do that and talk about stiffer penalties with regard to those straw transactions, that trafficking in guns, so to speak. And at the same time, we need legislation to close those loopholes, the gun purchases at the gun shows, the online purchases, the purchases from your neighbor or friend or somebody else outside of the licensed gun dealer.
After Parkland, Representative Henne, you were moved, as you told us earlier, and you've introduced legislation having in this session that would enhance some gun laws. Explain a little bit about what you proposed and if you think that's enough.
When you say that's enough, when somebody,
Well, if there's anything else that
this
you
was
that
an
you would
attempt
think.
to bring parties together. Okay, there were pro-gun, anti-gun, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrats, all on this committee that came together to put together these ideas. Okay, and if you'd like, I'll go through the ideas on them. Okay, the first thing is the extreme risk protection order. And I think this would have prevented Parkland. I think it would have prevented the one down in Cincinnati. So if a family member or a police officer, after doing an investigation, believes someone wants to do harm to themselves or others, they can petition the court to have their guns removed for a period of time. Okay, it would require a 72-hour hearing. So they would. So they bring the thing, they would have a hearing within 72 hours. The person would have a right to have due process. They would be there to able to defend their position. So we don't get the ex-wife who just wants to punish her husband. So they would have due process, because that does happen. It happens on a regular basis, and I heard that from multiple sources when I introduced the legislation. The bill originally had, and I have since taken it out because it was a very untenable position of the bill, that if it wasn't what's the word, it's going to happen soon, that they could get an ex parte. They could have the guns taken and then have the hearing within 72 hours. Okay, the kickback from many parties and many from my caucus, that wasn't going to fly. So that piece was taken out of the bill. But I thought that was a very reasonable approach. We're protecting due process, so we're protecting the Second Amendment right while still getting the guns away from people who should not have guns. The next piece is allow better enforcement of the current gun laws. Okay, weapons disability. If you have a weapons disability because you're a felon or you have a domestic violence protective order or whatever reasons you have a weapons disability, you were dishonorably discharged from the military, okay? Ohio law, we would put that in Ohio law so that Ohio police officers can enforce that law. Same thing with the armor-piercing ammunition. We would also outlaw armor-piercing ammunition to give local law enforcement. The straw man purchase, we would mirror the federal law on the straw man purchases. We would require every protective order to be put into the NICS system, which is what feeds the background checks. So if you have a protective order, we must be put into NICS system within, I forget the reasonable amount of time, so that we can, if the person's not supposed to have a gun, we have the data that we can tell them they can't have the gun. And then we were going to adopt the federal definition of automatic firearm. So when the federal government puts bump stocks, if they are planned to do, into the definition of a machine gun, we would automatically have that in our law, so we can also enforce it. Every pro-gun supporter will tell you that there are already enough laws on the books. This is about enforcing the laws that are already on the books. They all say that it's not the gun, it's the individual. Well, the extreme risk protection order targets the individual who wants to do harm. It doesn't go after anybody's particular guns or guns in general. And the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. This is trying to get the guns out of the hands of the bad guy with the guns and still protecting the right of the good guy with the guns. So it was a balanced approach. I thought and it's not done. We're still working on it. It's more of an uphill battle than I originally thought it was going to be. But it's as I say, it moves the dial. I think it does protect people. It will save lives. Once again, Parkland, I think the Cincinnati shooting both showed signs that they wanted to hurt people, and we could have gotten those guns away from them. So it's a good start. Is it everything? No, but I think it could save lives.
Did you say though that the Republican caucus, they did not go for the red flag language in your
the
bill?
extreme risk or the ex parte. Due process is very important. When you take away anybody's right, no matter what that right is, due process should be part of the thing. Before you imprison somebody, they have to go to.
So they said that has to be in there for them to support it. Is what
No,
you're
the ex
saying?
parte would have to come out of the bill.
Would have to come out.
Yes, they did. They
Okay.
wanted to make sure we had due process. Ex parte was prior to due process.
Oh, I see. Okay. Senator Skindell.
Sure. The red flag, which is the extreme risk legislation, red flag, many folks, Moms Demand Action, talk about it as the red flag warning. Connecticut has a red flag, and they did a study in Connecticut after they introduced it, and that study indicated that it, on suicides alone, it diverted some 72 suicides. And we know that 2/3 of gun deaths are actually suicide. But the red flag addresses a number of situations. And when they talk about due process, I support a red flag legislation that allows that ex parte decision by the judge, but then to have that hearing within 72 hours after that. That is due process. We have that in place in many scenarios where you have a temporary order and then a full hearing within a short period of time after that. That ensures due process. So the argument that is, no, you have to have the full-blown hearing before you take the gun away really doesn't solve the situation, and actually may create more harm, because that may, if somebody's aware that there's an effort to take away a gun beforehand, they may take action earlier than anticipated. So I have deep concerns about that.
Well, let me stop you a second. Are you saying though that there's a area of agreement there with the red flag?
With Representative Henne and I, there's agreement. The problem is that his caucus wanted to remove the ex parte temporary restraining order out of it. They wanted the full-blown hearing before.
So you think that goes far enough in that regard? The red flag legislation, that that deals with that issue sufficiently the way the language is in Representative Haney's bill?
That red flag language is good language that's in Representative Haney's bill that allows that ex parte judicial decision and then a full-blown hearing about 72 hours or so afterwards. But that's not what his caucus is insisting upon.
Right.
That's how it began. I mean, it did begin with that. Obviously I introduced the bill. I could accept that. But the legislation is it's about give and take.
Yeah.
And I mean, we all see nothing that starts normally ends the way it starts. So,
Okay.
made multiple changes.
Senator Skindell, you've introduced a bill too.
Correct. So there's been a number of bills introduced to provide reasonable gun regulation in the state of Ohio. This year is a bill that I reintroduced that had been in other general assemblies. And again, it's a ban on assault weapons here in Ohio. What we have seen is that the federal ban worked successfully that ran between 1996 and 2006. And the courts upheld that ban, saying that it was not an infringement upon the Second Amendment. And my belief is that based upon the evidence that's out there that we were able to attend, that ban, I actually would support the federal ban. But since the federal government allowed that ban to expire and refuses to address it, we need to address it in some states, state by state, and some other states have addressed it. But there's other legislation that has been brought forward to the Senate where I serve at. For example, that universal criminal background checks. That's been brought forward as legislation, which I've signed on. The keeping the guns out of domestic abuser hands. Representative Henne had talked about this. It's actually strong in some states. Ohio does not actually have strong language on domestic abusers. Those people that under a court order for domestic abuse, making sure that the guns are out of the hands. We don't have that law in Ohio. The red flag legislation that we discussed, that's also in the Senate, and that's something I've supported. Representative Henne talked about permitting the bump stocks, particularly after the Nevada shooting. That's legislation that has been brought forward in the Senate also. And I support the efforts by Representative Henne also that talks about the straw man purchasing, trying to limit that access. But we also need legislation to close those loopholes, such as the gun show or the online purchases, and making sure that we limit the transactions outside of the licensed gun dealer transactions.
One thing about assault weapons. And I know that term is somewhat unclear, but let's say automatic weapon is certainly an assault weapon, an automatic weapon where when you push the trigger and several shots, correct? That would be considered an automatic weapon?
Yes, and they're already illegal.
And they're already illegal. Semi-automatic weapons would be where you pull a trigger once, pop, but you go pop, 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 pop like that, which was used down in Cincinnati, which was used in a lot of places. Some would consider those automatic weapons. Real quickly, do we need, should semi-automatic weapons be legal? And would a restriction on those ever fly in the Ohio legislature?
Under the current legislature, no, it's not going to fly. And actually, my legislation, when we talk about an assault weapon, would cover the semi-automatic. So the discussion there, and this is something that I think should be open for public discussion, is how large should the cartridge, how many rounds should that cartridge be able to hold? So the general standard out there is that cartridge should only be holding maybe 10 or 15 rounds or so, somewhere in that nature, so that you limit that cartridge out there. The legislation that I introduced talked about a gun that has the built-in feature of a magazine that's greater than 10, or can carry a magazine greater than 10. Almost all semi-automatic guns, the way they're made today, they weren't made this way at one time, but the way they're made today can actually carry a magazine that's less than 10 or greater than 10. You know, the effort may, and I'm open for discussion in the public discussion. I think we should have a debate on this and let the bills have the hearings in the General Assembly as to how do you approach this.
Real quick on that.
Yeah.
Most weapons sold today are semi-automatic weapons. You can't just ban semi-automatic weapons. You're going to ban most weapons out there. The cartridge thing, I'm not going to speak for anybody. It's something I would entertain. I hope there's nobody from them gun groups here who have been beating me up on the internet, though. But it's something I'd talk about. You know, once again, I don't own guns. I'm a lifetime member of a NRA. I have a 100% voting record on gun issues with them. But I do think there are something, and the extreme risk protection order is something that NRA actually has. I can show you a video where they are saying that they can't accept it as long as there's due process. They would support that if there was due process. They've been pretty good to work with. Just some thoughts.
Okay. Question from the audience, Professor Flannery, I'll direct this to you. As mental health is an issue in more than 50% of gun homicides, I'm assuming that's an accurate percentage. What should the state do to, I think it says here, to keep guns out of the hands of those who need help? And we've talked about this a little bit, but what?
Well, I don't know if that's an accurate number. In fact, I think the data that we do know about is that there are way more people with mental health issues and psychiatric diagnoses that don't commit violence than there are people that do. Now, certainly when we're talking about more recently in the last few years, mass shootings in public places, and some of the more recent school shootings, particularly by adult perpetrators, when we are left with the after the fact psychological autopsying of the event, when somebody takes an act like that, there's something going on and there's something wrong with that person. And many times we will discover that that person was not under active care, not taking prescribed medication, et cetera, and there's a mental health issue that's involved, but not always that's well known to persons prior to the incident occurring. So again, I would go back to we just don't know enough about interpersonal gun violence and firearm injury and the role of mental health because we don't collect that information. I had a conversation with our medical examiner yesterday about they track gun homicides and firearm-related deaths and suicides, but there's no attempt to look at a mental health history when that person is a victim of a homicide, for example, for the victim or an alleged perpetrator. So we're just not asking those questions and collecting that information. I would say putting our mental health workers back in our schools is a significant preventive measure that can make a difference. We had them at one point when we cut our funding. We lost a lot of that sort of early identification of risk and the opportunity again early on in this continuum when someone ends up committing an act like a homicide with a firearm or shooting someone and injuring them. If we intervene earlier in that person's situation, we have a better chance of preventing that from occurring. The last thing I'll say about it is that one thing that's come from some of the school shootings, particularly Virginia Tech and subsequent shootings, is the threat assessment model that says if there are individuals at risk of perpetrating violence, whether that's a mass shooting or otherwise, there are models being developed in place. Case Western Reserve has a threat assessment team. Usually these are universities, large school systems, and some workplaces that say there are a number of risk factors that if someone is of concern as a potential perpetrator of violence, not just a mass shooter, that there's a mechanism in place to gather information, to share it across providers and systems, law enforcement, mental health, academics, et cetera, in order to be able to take action. Just like we've socialized everyone to say, take a threat to hurt yourself seriously. if you are going to hurt yourself and threaten suicide, as a provider, as a teacher, as a law enforcement person, you are required now by law to report that. And then we do an assessment of that person's risk and ask a number of questions about risk factors, recent events, previous attempts, etc. We're beginning to do the same thing about threats of interpersonal violence. Dr. Singer, who's here tonight, has done some of that research about looking at the relationship between threats and actual perpetration of violence. And guess what? People who make more threats are more likely to actually perpetrate violence. So a threat assessment approach to this issue is perhaps sort of a non-conflictual way to say we just need models in place so the right people can get this information, share it with each other, and take action in a preventive way as opposed to a post-incident response.
Would that require legislation to do something like that?
No, I think it would require it would require resources in terms of the team. It's time and effort. The legislation part is the HIPAA and FERPA rules that sometimes restrict sharing of information around mental health treatment with various folks, et cetera. That's where we run into some of the barriers.
I think universally we all would agree we do not do a good job of dealing with mental health in this state and probably the whole country. I think that's something we can all agree upon. It's how to deal with it. There's a stigma associated with getting mental health treatment too. So, there's a big problem there. I just want to share one thing. The same time when I was having my after the Parkland shooting, my mindset was changing. My school district, a bunch of students got together, and I mean, it was like 100 students got together, and they decided they wanted to do something in their district about this. And they came up with a three-prong approach, and they came and presented it to their representatives and senators, and I actually was able to get them in front of the governor to present their ideas. Three things that they broke into three groups. One was legislation. They wanted to review the legislation. They like my legislation. They like probably some of your legislation. There were other legislation that they thought would help. And they did say safety in school does affect their ability to learn. If they're fearful that they could, something could happen, it does affect their ability to learn. The next part was they got with the administration and the facilities people and talked about different things they should do to help protect them in the school, and resource officers, putting bolts on the door when there is an active shooter, things like that. And so they took it. And then the third thing was dealing with the mental health is, if there was a student, they wanted to make an inclusive environment. So they were going to work on a plan to find the student who feels, who they're, segregated from the rest of the population. I think all high school kids have a degree of that. But they were going to work to make it a more inclusive environment. Because typically the loner, the person who's feeling really rejected from society is the one who
Perpetrate.
There, one going to come out. New tongue. I'm just trying it out. So they were working a three-prong approach, and I think it's important when the kids were coming up with this. But mental health is obviously something in probably the whole country we need to do a better job of.
Let me switch gears just for a minute. There are Republicans who are willing to reach across the aisle on this issue. There are Democrats that are willing to reach across the aisle. There are Republicans who have an A rating from the NRA. There are Democrats who have an A rating from the NRA. Not as many, I'm sure. So I guess my question is gun control and the disagreements over gun control, is it as much a Democrat-Republican divide, or is it more of a rural urban divide? And the reason I bring this up is, Cleveland, if correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, used to have laws against concealed carry, used to have laws against open carry, used to have a variety of its own gun laws. This did not sit well with the conservative legislature in Columbus. And in 2006, they passed a law that the preemption law that's basically said all gun laws have to be state laws. So it basically preempted anything the city of Cleveland wanted to do. These were laws that the city of Cleveland enacted to do battle with gun violence, and they were prevented from doing that. And that's why, at the Republican National Convention, you had people walking through public square with AK-15s, to make a point. But my question is this: is if the city of Cleveland thinks it's in their best interest to have gun laws that restrict certain types of weapons or restrict where they can be taken, why shouldn't the legislature in Columbus allow them to do that?
You guys can meet it.
I'm asking any of you, all of you.
I will tell you the narrative is the individual has a right to protect themselves. Why should the city take away an individual's right to protect themselves? Okay, I mean, we have laws that allow people to have guns. The people who have concealed carry are some of the most law-abiding citizens. I think their incidence of crime is less than police officers. Excuse me, but I mean, statistically speaking. So why are we taking away their right to protect themselves because the cities don't like guns?
So again, I grew up in a somewhat rural area around guns. I now live in a strong urban setting. The city of Lakewood, for example, just the first suburb west of Cleveland, is the most densely populated community between New York and Chicago. So I've had the experience in both settings. I know that in many of the rural settings, it's very hard to come across a person who has not handled a gun at one time or another. In an urban setting, there's a large percentage of the population that has never touched a gun for the most part. So I think there's tensions and beliefs in both settings. And I think you need to try to find that ground that kind of addresses the beliefs within the rural setting as well as the beliefs in the urban setting. And that's why I was strongly supportive of the local laws, the local Cleveland laws that tried, the city council met with discussions among their population to pass a law that they thought would try to address the needs in their community. And I support that local effort. For the state to dictate and say that the needs of a particular densely populated urban setting is the same thing as a less denser rural setting, I think the state got it wrong. And that's why I voted against the preemption bill. And when Governor Taft vetoed that bill, I supported Governor Taft in the veto of that preemption bill. And I strongly continue to support, again, local communities trying to address it in the best way they seem fit.
Can I ask a question,
Sure.
please? For
Yeah.
most of the shootings within the urban setting, would you say they are criminal element, or are they the law-abiding citizens?
Well, I mean, most of the shootings, are they done by a criminal element or law-abiding citizens? Yeah, I mean, if you commit a shooting, hurt somebody, you're a criminal. So
The point being, if you're going to get away the gun rights of the law-abiding citizens, criminals by definition do not obey laws. Okay, so if they're carrying guns and I would think that taking the guns away from the person who's a law-abiding citizen who has got their concealed carry and gone through that, I think it's like 8 hours of training, taking away their guns is counterproductive.
So I'm a really stay in my lane here and talk as a law, because I took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. And contained within that oath is to support the Second Amendment, an individual's right to carry and bear arms. When we talk about law enforcement, I think the discussion gets lost into the purpose of the Second Amendment. And again, when I say that gets lost, because most people think that cops or that an organization, a municipality wants to know where the firearms are because we want to take that firearm. And then that's not true. As a police chief and I also served as a commander for 8.5 years with the city of Cleveland, I was never interested in taking a firearm away from an owner, regardless if that firearm was registered at the time with the city of Cleveland or not. That just was not our goal. That was not our mission. And it isn't today. We are not interested in taking guns away from owners, period. We're not. What we are interested in is filling a loophole or meeting or closing a loophole where when a firearm is used in the commission of a crime, and we have the person who's responsible for that crime, right? We have a suspect identified and he's arrested. Our investigation compels us, this is not a discretionary, it compels us to track down the origin of where that person obtained the firearm. And so from a law enforcement perspective, that's where I need help. I need help in going backwards from the point of recovering that firearm to the next level back, which is, where did you get that firearm? And I think that that's where we all get lost in the weeds, if I may say so respectfully. Because now, well, why do you want to know where that gun came from? Well, I'll tell you why we want to know where, because we have a responsibility by law to find out not only who's responsible for a crime, but where did they get the access to commit that crime? Because believe it or not, law enforcement is also responsible for preventive efforts. In order for law enforcement to engage in proactive preventive efforts, we need to know where these firearms are coming from so that we can set up our own plan, we can build intelligence, we can do whatever it is that we need to do from a law enforcement perspective to prevent, you may have heard this term before, prevent the flow of guns from coming into a neighborhood. That's where I'm at. This is not about going to somebody's house and saying, hi, you're a gun owner? Do you have a gun in the house? Give me your gun. It's not about that. I totally, and every law enforcement officer that operates in the city, in the state of Ohio, has taken the same oath that I did, which is to protect individuals' rights, including the right to carry, own, bear arms. We're not interested in taking guns away from responsible homeowners who are collectors and they have this and they hobbyists or they go hunting or whatever. We're not interested in doing that. But what we need to do is we need to have something in play so that when a firearm is used in a commission of a crime, in order to help us solve that crime, we need to know who is responsible for that. That's number one. Everybody wants to know that. And then number two, to prevent this from occurring again, or is there a pattern occurring where not only did this Johnny have a firearm or Mickey have a firearm, but does Susie, does Sally, do all these people also have firearms? And if it is, I want to track that down. That's what I'm asking for help on, is give me the tools that if the perpetrator, the suspect, the arrested individual does not want to cooperate and give me information, at the very least, I can go in and say, here's a serial number, make, model, boom. Oh, that's where the gun came from. We do that with cars now, by the way, in case you didn't know that. I mean, we can track backwards probably to where that vehicle was manufactured. What year did it come out in May or did it come out September? I don't understand why we don't have a similar tool like that for tracking a firearm.
And staying on the subject of the preemption bill, when I talked with legislators who voted for it, one of the main reasons they gave for voting for it is that if you've got somebody who lives downstate and they're carrying a gun, they have a gun with them, and they're traveling across state, and they go through a town that has its own gun laws that restrict, say, a concealed carry or some other law that pertains to carrying their gun in their car or whatever, that they're temporarily in an illegal posture, and that this was an attempt to make it so that it's uniform, so that people can come and go wherever they are, and they're always going to be, as long as they're following the state law, they're always going to be within the law. Is that a valid reason for the preemption law? This notion that if I go from one community to the next, I'm going to have to throw my gun out the window, or I'm going to be not in compliance with the law.
So we do that. We have individual laws in cities all the time, and people need to know the laws of that particular jurisdiction. With regard to the transport, the state could address that pursuant to legislation, that specific issue, that if you're driving through a particular community, you're not immediately in violation of their local ordinance. The state can address that type of issue. The issues of Cleveland trying to ensure that in a densely populated community that people are not carrying their firearms into the local drinking hole, where it becomes very dangerous to have a firearm and the result of harm, or into the Sunday afternoon Browns game to have anybody that wishes to bring their guns there, or to have other checks and balances in this system. The laws, I think every legislator out there, whether at a city council level or in the state legislature and the Congress, does not want to take guns away from those people that truly want to own and possess a gun for safety, or own or possess a gun for legitimate sporting purposes. And the key is to try to strike that balance. But what we're going to is a system that the gun owners trump all other considerations to the permitless gun carrying society, and that's the direction that we should not be going to. We should have those reasonable regulations.
Yeah, we have a gun culture here in this state and in this country. We have young people who carry guns because they grow up in a neighborhood where they believe that's the thing that they have to do to ensure their own safety, rather than being intent on perpetrating a criminal activity. A person isn't a criminal using a firearm until they use a firearm in the commission of some act, because they're under the influence, they're in a domestic dispute, they're pissed off about something, or there's an accidental shooting, and they're the ones that were responsible for that storage and safety of that firearm. We just quickly go to our corners on this issue. So saying, my right to safety should be balanced with your right to carry a firearm, conceal it, or open carry it wherever, in most places you want to go. That's not taking away your right to own a gun. We don't need to arm our teachers and put more guns in our schools. That increases the risk of something bad's going to happen. And I think my law enforcement colleague would say, yeah, this is a concern when you're a first responder, knowing who's the perpetrator and who's, the legal gun owner. So there are a lot of things that I'll go back to, we just don't know. So we go to our extreme positions on this issue, and it's been really hard to find the middle ground. I think we need to ask our young people what they think we should do, because we haven't figured this out yet. So I've said this before publicly. I think having youth voice and encouraging that is important, because us adults have screwed it up and we haven't really figured out the right solutions.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I knew coming from Southwest Ohio to Northeast Ohio, we're, other than winning football team, that's the only thing we haven't different. We're much more conservative in the Southwest Ohio of the state than we are in North. I knew it was going to be a semi-uncomfortable situation. But you know, taking into a drinking establishment, already illegal. Possessing a gun while you're drinking, already illegal. There was a couple other things that we already are illegal to do. And once again, the person who has gone through the training to have a concealed carry are the most law-abiding citizens out there. And you to say that, and the Browns, if you want to, the Browns are already allowed to exclude having guns into their establishment. Any establishment can establish those rules, and then I can choose to go there or not. Okay, but to say we're going to take the guns from the law-abiding citizens while the criminal is still allowed to carry the gun, and when I say allowed, because they don't obey the law, they will still possess the gun. It doesn't. It may make us feel good, but it doesn't move the dial.
Okay, we've got about 8-9 minutes. I've got several questions from the audience. I want to try to get through them. So if somebody knows the answer, go ahead and give it quickly if possible. What is the current Ohio law about bump stocks? Can they currently be manufactured in Ohio, sold in Ohio?
They are not illegal at this point.
They're not illegal. Okay.
By the way, most of my gun-toting friends would support that, getting rid of those.
And now again, I'm reading this, so I don't know. I can't speak to the validity. Ohio only requires 8 hours of class and practice time, total time to qualify to carry a concealed gun. Shooting a target with a gun requires skill, i.e. target practice. Should Ohio require a skill proficiency test to protect bystanders from stray bullets? Any thoughts?
As the gun person, I would not have an opposition to exploring the facts on that. I mean, that doesn't sound unreasonable to me.
Yeah.
When the original concealed carry came in, we had 12 hours of training and a little bit larger amount of time actually handling a gun. Last session, at the objections of the NRA, but the support of the Ohio Buckeye Firearms, they lowered the standard from the 12 hours to 8 hours.
Okay. We haven't talked about the stand your ground legislation, that's pending. And this question here is, rumor has it. Was it? Well, this isn't too difficult, I don't. Rumor has it that the Ohio General Assembly might consider combining the stand your ground legislation with the proposed red flag laws, temporary gun removal during the lame duck session.
Well, I will tell you, the governor has said he will veto any stand your ground legislation. So politically speaking, if they want to force his hand on that, leadership may look to combine that. I don't know. I mean, that's above my pay grade.
Okay. And this is something that we've already talked about, but I'll ask it again. What can individuals do to advocate for increased federal research on gun violence, i.e. repealing the Dickey Amendment? Professor, is that something you're...
Yeah, I think that's the legislator who penned that in the 90s. Write your Congress people and say, at least we need to at least support the research to ask the questions to gather the information. It's not about taking sides one way or the other. We've been restricted from even gathering, asking those questions. So write your congressman.
Okay.
I agree. As Professor Flannery said, communicate with your congressional person with regard to that research ban, and remember to vote.
And this is a theory that I've heard before, and maybe it's worth commenting on. Will a control on bullet purchases or bullet purchasing, limiting the amount of bullet purchases, decrease mass shootings? I've heard that theory before. I don't know if
It's been discussed
Makes
as an
sense.
economic approach
Yeah.
to trying to reduce what people have access to in terms of armor piercing, armamentation, and taxing bullets as a way to have people not own so many. I don't know if I don't know if that would work or not, but hit them in their wallet is one approach that's been discussed.
Be good to look at that research on that, the federal reason.
There isn't any.
You say, one thing that stuck out in what you said there, hit them where they hurt. Law-abiding citizens use bullets. I have friends that go to the shooting range on a regular basis. Why do we want to penalize? If we're going to tax, let's make it a taxation for representation. Maybe the taxation, any tax collected will be used into
Right.
providing or safety for schools or something like that.
Sure.
Not just to penalize. Taxation for penalization of law-abiding citizens is not something I think is
I
practical.
wasn't
reason.
suggesting that it was being discussed as a penalty. I was suggesting that there's certain folks in the conversation that say, how can we limit, again, people, internet purchasing thousands of rounds of ammunition. So again, you do get into the conversation about sport, and what's my right to own certain firearms for sport or hunting, versus people that are purchasing firearms for illicit purposes or illegally. So a lot of things in this country are driven by economics. That's just one part of the conversation.
So let me finish up with this. I think Representative Henne, you may have made this comment, and I've heard it many, many times before, that the only way to stop a bad man, the only person who can stop a bad man with a gun is a good man with a gun. Is that the only way? I mean, will all these other suggestions, could they decrease the amount of gun violence that we have, or is it all left up to whoever has the best aim?
No, that's not the only solution. Gun violence, and take the word gun out of it, because I think guns tend to create an emotion in people and go to your respective corners or have to declare a letter. Violence is a public health issue. And the only way that we are going to win the issue against violence is by approaching those that know how to triage, how to recognize the trauma, and get into what caused the violence to begin with. When you introduce a gun into a situation, I think a gun just facilitates the outcome, which makes it more horrible, and which makes everybody now say, oh my God, a gun is involved. But really, when you can substitute the word gun for a knife or a bat or a fist or whatever the case is. So while we are passionate about guns, and there is a growing prevalence of guns on the streets, we know this, the issue is, what are we going to do about violence? And how are we going to address not just the symptoms, because cops are very good at addressing the symptoms, but folks, we need help in addressing the underlying issues that cause the symptoms to come out. What is causing an individual to have so much fear that they have to go to the corner and pick up a gun in order for them to protect themselves? What is happening in our communities, in our society, that is causing an individual who is responsible citizen to have a discussion in their home that says, you know what? I'm afraid of this level of violence that's going on, so now I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy a gun to protect my family. I think that for us, it's not the issue of the gun, although I understand that that's why we're here, and I understand that that's, the emotional trigger here, but it's about the level of violence that exists in the United States, in our urban populations, and we even seen it growing, extending into our rural populations here, where you can have two cops that are going in to serve a search warrant, and because the existence of a firearm, but it could have been the existence of anything else. It resorted to a violent situation where we lost the lives of two officers. So I think at whole, we need to address the issue of violence. If we want to equate it to gun, okay, so be it. But the issue is, what are we going to do about violence? How are we going to teach our kids that are growing up today that the way that they handle violence, the way they handle conflict is not the healthy way? And I really believe that if we start addressing that, and if we teach alternatives, and we teach this young population, these kids, that there is another way to resolve conflict besides grabbing a bat, a knife, or a gun, that down the road, we will become a much safer society. But that's just coming from me, Andy Gonzalez.
Last question, Chief, on this very issue. Why do our youth resort to so much gun violence?
They learn it.
From?
I mean, you see it on TV, it's glorified.
Yeah.
Number one, video games is glorified in there. They go into the neighborhoods and they see the older adults carrying firearms, and it's a means of instant power. When you look at the issue of why people carry guns, why do cops carry guns? Because it's a symbol of authority and it's a symbol of power. That's why cops carry guns. Why do we arm our military when they go off to war with firearms? Because it's a symbol of power. It's a symbol of authority. Now, when there is nothing else, when I feel less than you, or if you have made me feel less than you, whether it be by bullying or threatening or picking on me or whatever, growing up, I'm learning that I've got to do something to indicate to you that I am more powerful than you. And unfortunately, in today's environment, the greatest symbol of being more powerful than another person is to have a firearm. I'm not intending on using that firearm, but if I have it in my backpack, or if I keep it in the car, or if I keep it in the back seat, or if I keep it wherever, and I show it to you, I am now demonstrating to you that I have power. So the number one reason why youth, kids, and perhaps even some adults are carrying these firearms, self-protection, but there's a need for self-protection because they want to feel powerful as opposed to feel powerless.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good last word, unless there's anything else the panel wants to add. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming.